Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very warm welcome from whichever part of the world you are. Today is a very special day for us at the Foundation for Universal Responsibility. It was 35 years ago, on the 10th of December 1989, that His Holiness received the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was part of the money from that prize that the Foundation for Universal Responsibility was established. And at a purely personal note, I was deeply blessed and privileged to be with His Holiness on that occasion. And so I feel blessed several times over, and not the least with the presence of Venerable Thubten Chodron, who's not only a revered Tibetan Buddhist nun, author, and teacher, who has devoted her life to sharing the profound wisdom of the Dharma. She was ordained in 1977 under the guidance of His Holiness, and has since become a leading voice in making Tibetan Buddhism accessible to the world. But most importantly, for me personally, as a gesture of celebrating her and gratitude, she has co-authored a series of 10 definitive books by His Holiness. The final volume of that has only just been released on Tibetan Buddhism. And as someone who has worked with His Holiness, I know what an amazing contribution and achievement that is to work with His Holiness, to document in so much detail his philosophies and ideas, and in fact make them more accessible to us readers. And so thank you, Thubten Chodron, for that very, very important contribution to the work and mission of His Holiness. And before we plunge into celebrating and understanding His Holiness, may I invite you for a brief a benediction or a few words to help us get our motivations right.
Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I feel quite privileged and honored. So if we just set our motivation, because that's the most important thing in any action we do. And since we'll be talking about His Holiness and his contribution to the world and to the Buddha Dharma, let's cultivate a motivation of compassion for each and every living being, because that's the motivation His Holiness has. It's the motivation the Buddha has. And so we should try and put our own motivation in line with theirs. So to first think of the kindness of all living beings and how we depend on them for everything we have, everything we know. And to cherish all these living beings, whether we like them or not, whether they agree with us or not, but to see beyond those superficial things and realize that each and every living being has the potential to become a fully awakened Buddha, and that all of us ordinary beings are overwhelmed by our mental afflictions, and therefore having an attitude of compassion and kindness towards us, as well as respect for our potential to become fully awakened, then that puts us in line with His Holiness's way of thinking. So with that kind of motivation, let us begin.
Well, before I sort of start this conversation and ask you the first question, I must say that listening to you reminded me of the amazing guided meditations that you have put together on the Lam Rim, and which I have been using for many, many, many years. And so before we plunge into this conversation, I wanted to thank you for that very seminal contribution and to recommend that to anyone who's watching this program. Because one of the challenges on the path is that, as you know and you teach, is to move beyond the intellectual understanding to the experiential one. And I think that has been a wonderful contribution to my learning and practice, failing practice, I dare add, to Buddhism. But anyway, we'll move on quickly to His Holiness. And could you share with us your earliest encounter, His Holiness at first sight, and what was most striking about his presence and his teaching?
Well, it's interesting. I was, I lived in Dharamsala since I went to Nepal and then to Dharamsala, 1975. But I didn't really know who His Holiness was. I didn't know much about Buddhism at all. And then in early 1977, I think it was, His Holiness was teaching Shantideva's text in Bodh Gaya. And I went. And in those days, there was no English, simultaneous English translation. So we sat through the whole teachings day after day, many hours, listening to the Tibetan, which I didn't understand at all. And then in the afternoon, Alex Berzin gave us a synopsis in English of what His Holiness was saying. And so my first impression was, I think, just the way he held the attention of people, and especially Shantideva's teachings, which I didn't understand any of. Something was going on there, even though it was all in Tibetan. And then, of course, hearing the synopsis later on really made me so interested and inspired some confidence in His Holiness as a teacher. So it was very minimal.
I think that's a remarkable presence in the sense of His Holiness, and it's difficult to put one's finger on it. That you just in his presence, even if you don't understand what he was saying for such a long period of time, he leaves an impression on you. And as a practitioner yourself, can you help us understand, what is behind that quality? He says religion is his kindness, and he talks so much about compassion. And so it's sort of like a non-verbal communication of who he is through the deep compassion that he feels. So you just feel it, sort of non-conceptually, and it touches you deeply. So how does this sort of seemingly simple idea sort of reflect the depth of his own spiritual practice and philosophy and who he is?
Well, it shows that he lives what he teaches, and that he's not phony. He's not just talking the talk. He really means it, and that he's trained his own mind and become the qualities that he's trying to teach us to cultivate as well. And I've been in teachings in the West, especially, where people don't know anything about him, just the title, the Dalai Lama, and they come to these big public talks, and His Holiness walks in the room, and some people just start tearing up and crying because of that presence. Yeah. So it's remarkable.
So, compassion is central to his teachings, but in what ways does he make these ideas accessible and practical in our lives, and help us make it practical and accessible in our lives
I
as a teacher.
Yeah, well, one thing I've noticed when he teaches, at least in the West, which is a difficult audience because when he teaches in India, it's people who are already Buddhists. In the West, it's who knows who's coming to the teachings, and it's a huge auditorium. But he has this ability to start out about something simple, about kindness, for example, and then dive into very deep philosophy, talking about the two truths or the four truths, and then come out of that and talk about compassion and something everybody can understand, and then dive back into philosophy and go in and out like this so that everybody gets something from the talk. Yeah. And it really it moves you, and his ability, I must say, as one of his students, to weave in and out so in a talk everybody can understand something, and the people who need the more profound teachings can get that as well. It's remarkable as a teacher. And another thing he does is he will take points from different teachers or different of the ancient Indian commentators, and he will connect things that when he connects those points from this one to this one, you go like, why, of course, why didn't I see that before? But, he just brings these things together in a way that you may never have thought of before, and then makes them something that to put into practice. Yeah.
His Holiness often talks about the importance of method and wisdom, the
Yes.
practice and the wisdom.
Yes.
And as a co-author of his teachings, and in your own teachings, give us a sense of why and in what ways, perhaps, that apart from embodying his teachings, what is the core of His Holiness's teachings and understanding of compassion, beyond the common rhetoric of compassion and equating it with kindness and generosity or altruism, and as the embodiment of Avalokiteshvara and compassion. There, it's a very deep philosophy that he presents. So, what is the core of that idea?
I think, one time somebody asked His Holiness if Buddhism had like a brand, or, one phrase that encapsulated it, a slogan, what would it be? And His Holiness said, dependent arising. Okay, now very often when we think of dependent arising, we think of the wisdom side of the path, because dependent arising is proof that things lack inherent nature. But dependent arising also applies to the method side of the path, because we are dependent on all other living beings. And His Holiness really brings that home, that, he combines the method and wisdom. We are not inherently existent, independent people, in charge of everything, but rather, when you really look at it, we're composed of so many different facets, and so many different qualities, none of which are who we are. And so that dependent nature of, constituting the self, and the dependent nature that we depend on all other living beings, that we cannot survive on our own. And really bringing that into the heart, that and to see it in our own life, that our food comes from others, our clothing, everything comes from others, but also all of our knowledge comes from others. We weren't born with whatever knowledge we have, whatever talents we have, whatever abilities we have. It all came because other people taught us, other people supported us. And so he really brings that aspect of dependent arising in terms of, generating compassion, and then combines it with, well, yeah, we are dependent on all these sentient beings, but for that very same reason that we are dependent, we also lack any kind of inherent existence. So he puts the two together. Yeah. And this is very much in line with Chandrakirti when he talks about the three kinds of compassion. And the last kind is when you see sentient beings as empty, yeah, and you've meditated on emptiness before, you see them as empty, and then you come out of that, but the flavor of the meditation on emptiness remains. And then you you generate compassion for sentient beings who don't understand emptiness and who suffer in samsara because they don't. And so there he puts them right together. It's really remarkable, and in your meditation gives you a lot to chew on. And I've noticed that especially lately, when His Holiness has done, not this year, but previous years, when he's done calls online and teachings online, for an hour or so, he's been talking about the meditation on the, how do you call it? I'm missing the title. I'll come up with it. But he leads us in it, and where we visualize a flat moon disk at our heart and think of compassion and meditate on compassion, and then visualize an upright Vajra at our heart and think of wisdom. And this is, again, it's something that comes in Tantrayana, in the empowerment, but he teaches us it to everybody. Yeah. And this combination of compassion and wisdom, of method and wisdom.
I think what His Holiness does is that he puts out these teachings and he says we can receive them as blessings and not sort of as commitments that we might fail to honor. But equally, in a sense that many of the meditations on nurturing compassion, things like, and tell us about them, because you teach these practices yourself, is exchanging oneself with others, looking at everyone as your mother. So even if you aren't into the deeper sort of realms of Buddhist philosophy and shunya and the emptiness of inherent existence, to be able to access the experience of compassion and that a little shift in how we relate to other people. So he's sort of navigating this large spectrum of people and with limited capacities such as mine to be able to access this idea and experience compassion. So tell us a little bit about the more accessible aspects of these practices.
He teaches, so much the two systems in the Mahayana, or at least as the Tibetans express it. So one, the 7-point instruction on cause and effect, and the second one, equalizing and exchanging, equalizing and exchanging self and others. And he'll teach both of them and praise both of them, but he prefers the latter one, the one that is taught by Shantideva. And that one also is the one that really grabs me, because you start out just equalizing your, first equalizing sentient beings so that you don't have preference for friends and aversion for enemies, but you see them equally. Yeah, which already is a huge step, isn't it? Because we get locked into our attachment, and these sentient beings are better, and locked into our hatred and anger, these sentient beings get rid of. And His Holiness says, no, yeah, they're actually equal. Um, and there's different ways to see that. One is that this person praises you today, so you like them, and that one criticizes you today, so you don't like them. But then tomorrow, that one praises you and you like them. This one criticizes you and you like them. Okay, or you don't like them. Okay, so that they change roles like that. But then you go deeper into that, and you have to equalize yourself with other living beings. And this, if equalizing friend, enemy, and stranger is challenging, equalizing self and others is even more so, because it's saying that it's making us question, why do I think I'm more important than everybody else? And the reason, when you look, why do I think I'm more important than everybody else, which I am? Well, the reason is because I am I. And there's no other reason but that. Yeah. And then you have to sit there and go, what I am the reason that I'm using to support my extreme self-centeredness is a really stupid reasoning. It doesn't work. Yeah. And then, His Holiness will say, well, look at it this way. There's all sentient beings who want happiness and not suffering. All of us. Yeah, we're all exactly the same, wanting happiness and not suffering. Okay. So that in one way, we're all equal. But this self-centered thought still says, I'm more important. So he says, we believe in democracy. So you have all countless sentient beings on one side, minus one. And that one that was subtracted is over here, who is me. So we're voting, whose happiness is more important? All sentient beings minus one, or one sentient being, me. Well, we lost the election. We lost the vote. All sentient beings are more important than us. And, that's something we really have to chew on and really, really understand deeply and be willing to challenge our own self-centeredness. But then His Holiness says, well, if you really want to be self-centered and you really just care about your own happiness, the best way to be happy is to cherish others. So he completely shatters that thing of protecting oneself. If you really want to be happy and care about yourself, you've got to cherish others. Why? Because others have been kind to us. And if we don't cherish them, then we live in a society of people that are miserable. And if we just give ourselves perks and keep everything nice for ourselves, yeah, and don't care about others, then others are going to be unhappy. Unhappy people don't just sit there and say, oh, yeah, it's fine. They are angry. And then we live with angry people. Are we happy when we live with angry people, with upset people? No. Yeah. And we just saw what happened in Syria. The government fell because the leader was concentrating on his own wealth, his own well-being, his own power, and the people were not happy.
It's amazing that His Holiness makes everyone feel special.
Yes.
and, and from presidents to bodyguards to whoever it might be, and that and it's in how he talks about the imperative of softening our sense of self, and that extrapolates with his engagement with science and modern psychology, and where people like Graham Coleman, who he's worked with in the mind-life dialogues, where they have looked at people who have mental problems, who are obsessed when they're documented or recorded with I, me, mine. And so he's looking for these techniques to soften the sense of that I, me, mine, the I that suffers, which then connects, of course, to the emptiness of the inherent existence and of the I. But I remember sort of in my own sort of early visits to Dharamsala, in the late 70s, early 80s, that the Tibetan monks used to pray, on their prayer mats, it said, pray for the Chinese. And
yes.
And their prayers used to say, "May the veils of ignorance lift from the Chinese." Okay. So it was just how you could express compassion, even for the enemy. But this inclusiveness and the celebration, in a sense, of diversity of His Holiness, and this is an area you have personally worked on, reaches out to interfaith dialogue and interfaith harmony. And His Holiness has moved beyond the idea of unity and diversity to celebrating diversity, and that, look, each one of us needs a different mental diet. Yeah. Now, what do you think might be the sort of the philosophical framework that he draws upon as a preeminent Buddhist monk, that enables him not to feel compromised and not for other people to feel that he is compromising the faith by going off to a mosque and doing the namaz, or going to a temple and singing a hymn? What is there in his philosophy and the ideas of the Buddha that enable him to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, because I've seen photos of him.
Yes.
The various people, and I've seen him wearing a yarmulke at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem.
That's right.
It's quite amazing, and he's just in it, and he's fine. I think what lies behind that is he says that just like at a smorgasbord or a buffet dinner, not everybody likes the same food. Some people like rice, some people like chapati, some people like noodles. But the important thing is that no matter what people eat and what they like, they're nourished. And so he says it's the same thing for religion, that for some people, Buddhism makes sense. For some people, it doesn't make sense. So, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, whatever, some other religion, that makes sense. And he says, because all the religions teach a very similar code of ethical conduct, not killing, not stealing, not lying, abandoning unwise and unkind sexual behavior, and so on. And all religions teach love and kindness and forgiveness. He says, as long as people are doing that and developing that in their mind, it doesn't really matter what philosophy they're following that help them understand that, because he says Buddhism isn't for everybody, and other religions meet their needs, and secular ethics. This is how he got into the whole topic of secular ethics. Is, that even people who don't follow any particular religion have an ethical system, and they can understand not to harm others, and that harming others, creates, inflicts pain, and also brings negative results to ourselves, even in this life. And if those religions believe in something after this life, then it brings pain to ourselves in later times. And so he can really be very open to all faiths and not feel like he's denigrating Buddhism or abandoning Buddhism. He's very sure in his own philosophy. And I know that when he talks to scientists who are not quite sure what the mind is and might want to reduce the mind to the brain, and they put forth that argument very strongly, His Holiness holds his ground, and he says, they're never really going to convince me that the mind is the brain, because they have two different natures. The mind is physical, the brain is clear and cognizant. So he has a philosophical background, for his openness. But also what allows for that is his genuine care and affection for people, and wanting to help them. And so he won't, with somebody who believes in another religion, he won't debate them and tell them, what you believe is wrong. He just says, practice that. All religions come to the same point when we talk about ethics and kindness. And philosophy, theology, that's kind of another part. We don't have to debate that.
I think what's amazing, what you're pointing to, that His Holiness is willing to do these things publicly,
Yes.
to go to a mosque and do the namaz, and say that even the experience, the non-conceptual experience of doing the namaz is valuable and legitimate. So it's not just a very sort of verbal, syncretic position that, look, all religions are the same, and so we should celebrate. But he's willing to make that gesture, write the Good Heart, a commentary on the Bible, and look at its virtues and its values. And I think the same thing with science. And perhaps that's an extension of what the Buddha said, that, look, my teachings must stand up to the scrutiny of reason, logic, and experience. And so His Holiness has kept himself open to unfolding knowledge. And so he argues that, look, if science cannot prove something, it doesn't mean it's not true. Unless it disproves it, we have to accept what science says. And so also give us a sense of the way in which His Holiness celebrates and presents Buddhism as a science of the mind. And drawing on his emphasis has shifted. When we set up the foundation, he used to talk about universal responsibility, but now he's talking about compassion, and he's talking about the Indo-Tibetan civilizational heritage. That offers the most sophisticated mind training techniques. And so those mind training techniques are sort of now engaging with science. So give us a sense of what is happening in that realm of His Holiness's interest.
I think, His Holiness has a very curious mind, and he's interested in everything. So at the conferences with the scientists, he's really interested in what they have to say and in drawing parallels and also in, pointing out differences. He, like you said, he doesn't say, oh, it's all the same. But he does say, we don't need science to prove Buddhism. Yeah. And we don't need Buddhism to prove science. Yeah. That we should see where they intersect, how they complement each other. But we don't need to say that they're the same. And that somehow the difference can really expand our mind to understand things that we haven't understood before. So I think he really enjoys that. He likes the scientists, yeah, and he just treats them, like old pals. So much so that you asked me before about one illustrations of His Holiness's compassion. Let me give you one because this has to do with the scientist. So it was right before one of the Mind Life conferences that I was fortunate to attend. And one of the scientists came in and said, "Hello, Dolly," which is, and then went up to His Holiness. He knew His Holiness from previous conferences. So he said, "Hello, Dolly," and went up and gave His Holiness a hug. And I'm sitting there going, that's not too cool. That's not the way to act on the Dalai Lama. His Holiness didn't blink. He totally fine, totally okay. Yeah. And that just shows his genuine kindness for people. He wasn't like, well, I'm the Dalai Lama, so you should treat me like this and this. He just was a thing, and that's the way he teaches too. He says to people, just see me as an older brother, an older brother in the Dharma, and I'm just sharing with you what I know and what works for me. So he's so incredibly humble. And I think that stimulates us having a lot of confidence in him because he acts in the exact opposite way than we would act. Let me give you another example. Right after he won the, well, actually during the time when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was also participating in a conference in Southern California.
That's right. That's when the news came of the award.
Yeah. And he was on a panel of experts. Okay, so he wasn't the only speaker. There was a whole panel of different experts in various fields. And somebody in the audience posed a question, and the experts all kind of looked to His Holiness and said, please answer it. And His Holiness sat there and he went, I don't know. And then he turned to all the other people on the panel and he said, what do you people think? And the auditorium was silent. The expert of experts on the stage said, I don't know. Oh my God, who would say that in an auditorium full of people when you're, and then he turned to them and he said, what do you people think? And he elicited their views. Yeah. And so that's the thing of, like you said, drawing people in, yeah, and bringing people together in that way. Yeah,
an extension of that is really that till not too long ago, he's going to be 90 in his universe is slowing down a bit, that he used to receive instruction and initiation from lamas much younger than himself. And so he never, from lamas younger than himself.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he never had this sense of hierarchy that, and he describes himself as a symbol Buddhist monk, and
Yes.
and means it.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing. He means it. He's not just saying it. And that's so unlike, I don't know about you, but it's very unlike me.
Me too.
Other people, you know.
So in what ways do you think this engagement with science and with other religions has in a sense taken the Buddha's teachings further? I just recount a conversation. I was moderating a dialogue between Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and His Holiness. And Rowan Williams said to His Holiness, "Your Holiness, the entire the community of the Spirit is grateful to you because you have taken further, you have legitimized, in a sense, the conversation with science and with other religions."
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, in what ways has this impacted Buddhism itself, and particularly, say, in the West, that you now have the idea of secular Buddhism and sort of different, Buddhism has sort of expanded its domain. And do you think the authenticity that somebody like His Holiness embodies has been in some ways compromised? Though I'm sure His Holiness embraces all efforts at everybody wants to be happy and avoid suffering. But how do you think this impacted Buddhism?
Okay, well, there's two: how it impacted the West, how it impacted Buddhism. How it impacted Buddhism, my first thought is the monasteries and nunneries in India are now having science education. And before, when I first came to Dharamsala, there was no science education. And in fact, many of the senior lamas were very skeptical of it. And when His Holiness would say, look, the scientists have measured how far the sun is from the earth and how far the moon is, and that the earth revolves around the sun, not the sun around the moon. Many of the senior lamas were like horrified because that's not what Vasubandhu said. And how dare we contradict Vasubandhu? And His Holiness said, look, if science can prove that this is correct, which it seems it can, then we have to follow what is true and not just say, well, because it's in the scriptures, it must be true. So His Holiness, this shows how he's always saying we have to rely on reasoning and logic, not on blind belief. And so this, affects how he sees science. He doesn't just blindly believe science. And, I personally don't blindly believe science because I see that the scientists change their mind a lot, like the rest of us. They do want to, I remember years ago when we weren't supposed to eat eggs and butter because it was bad for your health, and we were supposed to eat margarine. Then it became they said margarine was better for you. Then it was like they changed their mind. Don't eat margarine. There's too many polyunsaturated fats. Eat butter. It's better for you. So, science changes its minds, and because of what it proves, and His Holiness respects that. And so he brings that idea into Buddhism and teaches that to the monks, and that's very brave because, when you think of Tibetan Buddhism, it existed in Tibet with, for centuries upon centuries with very little outside influence. And so there was a certain way that you saw things, and that was it. And now His Holiness is saying, whoa, we have to open and apply the same kind of logic and reasoning we apply to the Buddhist teachings, also to science and to how we see the universe. Okay, then in terms of the other part, how it's affected things in the West, and you mentioned secular Buddhism. Personally speaking, I'm not speaking of His Holiness now. Personally speaking, I feel uncomfortable with calling it secular Buddhism because some of the people are saying, oh, the Buddha didn't teach X, Y, and Z, when it's clear in the scriptures that he did. So, and it's clear, at least for me, when I use logic and reasoning, that those things are true. And so to say the Buddha didn't teach it, or you don't have to believe it, in one way, His Holiness will say that, in the sense that, people will come along and they'll they appreciate the idea of love and compassion that Buddhism teaches. And they wonder if they have to be a Buddhist to, to follow those teachings. And His Holiness says, no, he says, technically speaking, according to the traditional way, you should believe in rebirth. Because if you hold the idea of rebirth, then the idea of compassion for all living beings has huge ramifications for how you cultivate compassion that would be quite different than if you say there's only this one life. So His Holiness will say, you can follow the Buddhist teachings, take what's valuable to you, take what makes sense to you, and what doesn't make sense to you, leave behind. So he's very open to teaching things to people. And that's the secular part. He will respect, them just picking certain things that they can use in their life to make them a better person. And he's totally fine with that. Okay. My qualm is calling it secular Buddhism. Why don't you just call it, like His Holiness does, secular ethics? Yeah. Or, call it something else, because sometimes I think it goes a little bit too far away from what the Buddha taught. This is my own personal view.
I think that for what it's worth, I agree with you. But I think at the same time that His Holiness is very discouraging of people converting and saying, "Look, this is serious stuff." And you don't move from your traditions and your own lived experience and your reflex responses. So, did you have in your own journey becoming a Buddhist nun? Was it challenging?
Not especially regarding that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I had already come to the point where the religion I grew up in, which talks about a creator God, I had already decided I don't believe that because it didn't make any sense to me. Later on, when I studied, Dharmakirti and how he refutes that, and Aryadeva refutes that, then it was like, oh, well, there's some similarities to the conclusion, my reasonings before I knew anything about Buddhism and theirs. And so I didn't struggle in that way. What was interesting in his evolution of saying, cautioning people not to convert, it happened in 1990, there was a delegation of Jews who came to Dharamsala and to have a dialogue with His Holiness. And one of the questions they asked was, how come the Jews asked His Holiness, how come some of our best and brightest have left Judaism and are now Buddhists? And His Holiness replied to them, well, there's something that they're seeing in Buddhism that, you may have in Judaism, but you don't teach it, things like the Kabbalah and so forth. So he encouraged them to draw out those kinds of teachings, and he was very clear, we are not trying to convert your people. Yeah. Then after that, he started really talking about not converting and being, and giving some examples of people who got confused by that. And at first, it made me really uncomfortable when he was talking like that, because it made me feel, I felt, because of my own afflictions, I felt that it was like saying we weren't welcome to Buddhism because we grew up in another faith. And so at first I was like, why are you saying that? Telling people to stick with their own religion. But then he would also at the very end say, but if Buddhism really makes more sense to you, then it's fine, to become a Buddhist. I went, oh, shoot, because that's what my experience was. And, I wanted to feel very welcome as a Buddhist. But I think he was doing that to really show to some of the religions where people are very sensitive to other religions trying to convert them, that he is not, and Buddhism in general is not one of those. Yeah, that we are not trying to say our religion is the best one. It's the only one that's true. Everybody should convert. Otherwise, you're missing out. He's not at all like that. And yet, coming back to this interfaith thing, he doesn't say all religions are the same either. And I heard about a conversation he had with one Anglican priest some years ago. And the Anglican priest he and His Holiness were good friends. They had met many, many times before and were friends. But the priest said, well, all religions come to the same point. And His Holiness said, we have to be careful there. We don't know that. And, he said there are differences in our philosophy. Yeah. And we have to respect those differences. We can't say that everything we believe is the same. There are differences. We should respect them. But that doesn't mean that we have to criticize the other faith. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that we say ours is the best. And the reason being what we talked about before, because what is best depends on the person and the disposition and the interest and the needs of that individual. There's not one best. Yeah, it's best according to the person.
In fact, His Holiness has gone so far as, to defend religions, singular and plural, because when 9/11 happened, he was the first religious leader of any tradition to speak out on behalf of Islam and said just because there are some negative elements or terrorists in that community doesn't mean that the entire religion should be dismissed. I don't know how much you have reflected on His Holiness's role, which he has now formally abdicated as the political leader of Tibet. But in a sense, the idea of Tibet and its political future is still attached to His Holiness and his persona. And so, how do you see this from a Buddhist perspective, and perhaps from His Holiness's perspective? That do you think this is His Holiness being pragmatic and being practical, which he is intensely, as it juxtaposes with the profound, the sacred, and the practical? So from a Buddhist perspective, and particularly the traditions of Buddhist activism and engaged Buddhism and what have you, how do you say, what do you think was going on in His Holiness's head when he said, look, I am going to abdicate any political role, not just for himself, but for the institution of the Dalai Lama? And I think that's very significant and has been missed, particularly when they talk about the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama to lead the Tibetan political movement. So how do you react to that? How do you see that?
I think His Holiness is being practical, and I think he's also being truthful. He accepted the responsibilities that Tibetans gave him as the holder of the institution of the Dalai Lama, and he held that responsibility for many years. And because the Tibetans were refugees in India, they needed some unifying figure, which he was, because he respected all the different Tibetan traditions. And so that, I think, really helped the cause of Tibet at that very crucial time and for many years afterwards. But then, as he ages, he wants the Tibetans to be able to carry on in a way that is in line with how things are done in the modern world. And I must say, Tibetan culture, is the only one I know of where the leader, His Holiness in this case, has power and wants to resign, but the followers say, no, we don't want you to. Whenever you see a leader that's very powerful, usually people are saying, get them out. And the Tibetans don't say that. But His Holiness sees, I think, that it's really best for the Tibetan situation in the long term to become more democratic, and to be able to work the different people from Amdo, Kam, and Utsang, the different Tibetan traditions, that religious traditions, that they all can learn to work together and not just rely on him. Okay? Because Tibetan society, my observation is that usually everybody looks to the leader, the Lama, the head, and as a result, it can sometimes be difficult to work together because they all want the leader to say what the case is. And he doesn't want that. He sees that, Tibet, if they go back to Tibet, if they stay in exile, whatever happens, that the Tibetan society needs to learn to work together. The people from from areas, different traditions, different monasteries, everybody needs to work together for the benefit of Tibet and for the benefit of the Buddha Dharma. And so I think he sees himself stepping back, taking the institution of the Dalai Lama out of the mix, and then having a representative government and a parliament, and a prime minister. I think that's really helping bring Tibetan society into a different way of governing that is more in accord or more in accord with what is done in the countries that he respects in the free world. Yeah. And I also think that he prefers to be a simple Buddhist monk and not a political leader. That he accepted that responsibility out of compassion. But in his heart, he would rather,
Right.
be a simple Buddhist monk and do what Buddhist monks do.
You're the founder and abbess of the Shavasti Abbey in Washington, and one of the few monastic communities in the West dedicated to training fully ordained Buddhist monks and nuns in the Tibetan tradition. And His Holiness has played a leading role in bringing women to the fore, and this whole the Geshe-mas, and as one of his I think very major contributions to gender justice or gender equality in all religions in that sense. And so what has been your experience with the gender sensitization, bringing in what is it like being a nun in Tibetan Buddhism, and what role does it? Yes, we want to know.
There's some Tibetans listening. I don't know what they'll say truthfully. Well, okay, I will be honest. As we know, most societies in this world are patriarchal and put men up and put women down. And Tibetan society is no different in that respect. And that patriarchy has affected Buddhism in Tibet as well, in a way that I think does not accord with what the Buddha really wanted, because the Buddha wanted all sentient beings to become awake. And when he first attained awakening, he said, I'm not going to pass away until there are the fourfold assembly: fully ordained monks, fully ordained women, fully ordained men. And then his lay followers, the lay followers who are men, lay followers who are women, the fourfold assembly. So the Buddha wanted everybody there. But then the patriarchy in the societies where Buddhism spread affected that in a way that I think harms the society itself. Okay, in the sense that you have half of the world who can contribute to the benefit of society, but who are not always in that society given the education and given the opportunity to contribute their wisdom, their knowledge, their compassion, their skills, their talents. And I think that is harmful to all societies where I keep saying patriotism, no, patriarchy reigns. Okay. So what was it like for me? Challenging to be a Buddhist nun, in the sense that, I have a college, I'm a university graduate, I worked, I had a job, I have the kind of personality where I say what I think, and so on. And so coming into Buddhism, when I first came in the 70s, I watched the model of the Tibetan nuns, and they were always so quiet and so meek and sitting in the last row. And like this, not to dare to ask a question, and then you have somebody like me, and I tried so hard to copy the Tibetan nuns. I thought that's how I was supposed to be, and it just didn't work. It didn't work. I'm from a different culture with different background. Yeah. So, uh, so I just had to begin to accept myself and at the same time accept the tradition. So in the West, we have a little slogan, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So when I am in India, in Nepal, in the Tibetan community, the monks go first, and I step back. I try and be polite, and I am polite. I do respect them. And then with the monks that I know more personally, on a personal level, then our friendship allows for a very free kind of discussion. Yeah. But in the General Assembly, I try and do what is expected of me as a nun. Okay. On the other hand, or I should say, not on the other hand, in addition, I very much wanted to be fully ordained, and that Tibetans do not have that lineage. So I went to Taiwan, and I received the Bhikshuni ordination there. Yeah. And His Holiness respects that. I asked his permission before I went, and I said, do I have your permission to go and receive the Bhikshuni ordination in Taiwan? And he said 5 words. He said, yes, of course, I'll pray.
But I wanted to that's what I was pointing to. His Holiness's singular contribution in the evolution of Tibetan Buddhism, and that he didn't, as the head of a faith, just decree that you would have geshe-mas, but he went through this whole process of consensus building, so that when this ordination happened and it was formally, structurally recognized, that there was already a consensus that existed within it. So within the faith, he functioned very democratically and practically, to bring that about. And
so I need to clarify, being a geshe-ma is not an ordination. It's an education degree.
Right.
So those nuns they still have not been able to take the full ordination of bhikshunis. But His Holiness is, like you said, consensus building, because he could do that, and getting the monks on board with it and then showing what the nuns can do has been tremendous and really opened the door for so many wisdom, so many women in Buddhism to learn and to contribute their talents and so forth. In the case of the Bhikshuni ordination, again, he wants to build consensus, because the ordination exists in some traditions, but not in others. And he says, I am not a pope. I cannot say now we're going to change that, because the Buddha set down a certain process of how to do it. And so he would like to have a conference of some of the chief monks in the various Buddhist traditions come together and together agree that they want to the traditions that do not have the full ordination for women, that to agree together that now this bhikshuni ordination will be possible. So that's his dream. But of course, we know getting people from different cultures who are the chiefs of those cultures and, their own Buddhist traditions, getting them together when they don't even speak the same language, because you have Tibetan and Mongolian and Thai, Sri Lankan and Japanese and everything, Vietnamese. They can't even talk to each other in the same religion, in the same language. To get them to agree, that is a very hefty goal. Yeah. So it would be really wonderful. I think he's, starting to encourage. Now I know in the monasteries in the south that there are some monks from Thailand going and spending some time in the south. That's a really good thing, because then the monks are really making friends and learning from actual practitioners in the other traditions. Because personally speaking, again, I think that there are two ways that I know of to begin the bhikshuni ordination in the traditions that don't have it, and that it is in the Chinese tradition. Yeah, the lineage is there, and I think that it's possible, but it really, I think His Holiness's idea is if everybody comes together and agrees, then later on, nobody can go, oh, well, you gave it, but it doesn't really conform to what's in the Vinaya.
Right.
So he doesn't want any controversy later. In the meantime, in terms of Western nuns, there's a few who have received the bhikshuni ordination, and I think that's been very good. And the Tibetan nuns now being geshis is fantastic, and they're really opening their minds and gaining confidence in teaching. And what I really hope is that Tibetan society will see the contribution that the nuns can make, starting with the geshimas, and then see that, if even more education for the nuns were good, and if the bhikshuni ordination could be, adopted, then it would be so beneficial for Tibetan society. And my argument to the Tibetan monks for that is that now in exile, there are fewer men going into the monastery. And this is kind of a crisis in a way, because the monastic system depends on debate. And for debate, you need a wide variety of opinions. So you need many monks, many nuns,
and debating with each other, the monks and the nuns.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's the pedagogical tool in the Tibetan monasteries. Debate is, and so I feel like if there were more, nuns with the full ordination, if the geshimas, were more plentiful, and if the nuns had more respect in Tibetan society, I think that could help to remedy the deficit in the number of monks joining the monasteries now. How? Because the nuns would go out and they would teach in the Tibetan community. They would teach the lay people. Yeah. And when the lay people hear the Buddha's teachings, and see the value of monastic life, then the parents, especially the mothers, would be much happier that their sons join the monastery and would send them to the monastery. And that would really help the monasteries to have more monks.
So this could be a seminal a moment in the evolution of Buddhism in sort of 2,500 years later, that this is beginning to sort of come together. A question that's come up on the chat box a number of times is that is His Holiness, the difference between reincarnation and rebirth. So what is His Holiness? Is he reincarnation, or has he been reborn?
Oh, it's, that depends so much on how you define the word, the words.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I know in the Theravada tradition and in some other traditions, rebirth is one thing, reincarnation is the other. And so the Buddhists would say people are reborn, but reincarnation implies a self and an Atman. And of course, that's one of the basic Buddhist tenets, that there is no Atman, it's Anatman. So some people define reincarnation and rebirth differently and come to that conclusion. Other people use the two words synonymously. Yeah, I'm not sure which way His Holiness does it. So in doing the Library of Wisdom and Compassion, I always used rebirth because that is much more in keeping with the more conservative view, so that the conservative people could realize that His Holiness is not advocating a substantially existent self, and that he's not saying that he himself is inherently existent or has a special soul or some kind of something that would be completely out of tune with what the Buddha taught.
His Holiness is going to be 90, and he's promised that he will live to 113, I think the figure is. And I know on occasion he said, look, I don't seem to be worried about it, but so many people are worried about my reincarnation and what's going to happen after me. But it's obviously very early. But what do you think that His Holiness's enduring legacy after another, 23 years will be when we look back at the life of the great master?
I think number one is the way he taught about world peace and the way he brings people together and, really advocates peace and not violence. And when you hear him, and I've heard him many, many times in teachings, tell the Tibetans, do not hate the Chinese communist. Do not hate the Chinese communists. Yeah. And, they are people, and you can't hate sentient beings who have the potential to become Buddhists. So he says that. And also, some of the young Tibetans are a little bit restless, and some of them might be inclined towards more violent tactics against the communist government. And His Holiness really puts a damper on that. He no, do not be violent. Yeah. And so, when you look at things, the Tibetans haven't gained their own country back, haven't gained their land, but neither have the Palestinians. And yet both of them, kind of lost their land around the same time in history. And, very few people have died for the cause of Tibet, but many have died for the cause of Palestine, which is, so horrifying and terrible that happened. So he I think that's one thing. I think.
What about in the evolution of Buddhism? You had the great teacher Dharmakriti, you mentioned Nagarjuna, Tisha, and what have you. So in the long history of Buddhism, what do we look at as His Holiness's unique and special contribution?
Well, he's saying, that all those ancient, people in the past knew what they were talking about. And you shouldn't, he doesn't say it this way. I say it this way. He doesn't say, oh, it's old, get rid of it. He says, study it, think about it. These people knew something, and they know that they knew or know what we ordinary beings don't. And if we want to really practice the Buddha's teachings, we need to go and study what these people said and not just say, oh, it's old or whatever. And so I've seen really in recent years his bringing up the Indo-Tibetan tradition and the incredible respect he has for India, saying that India is the older siblings of the Tibetans in Buddhism, and really respecting that, in many ways, the non-sectarian ability of the Indians. Along this line, I would really like to encourage that more in Indian society. I see now in the last few years, there's a bit of sectarianism, and religion, and a lot of religious disharmony. So I would really, His Holiness respects the Indian tradition so much that if what he says can help bring more respect and equality, that would be, I think, a really wonderful thing for India and for the world. India is the world's largest democracy. Yeah, it has an effect on the rest of the world. Yeah. So, effect on Buddhism, I think, bringing forth what the Indian commentators said. I think what he's doing in terms of women's equality will have an effect. And also, what he's doing with science. Yeah, because in Western history, as soon as science came along, Christianity said, you're wrong, wrong, you're a heretic, get rid of these people. And so His Holiness is really showing an example of how religion and science can come together on some points and can respect each other on other points because they have different opinions. So that's something pretty new, I think, in terms of the relationship of religions and Buddhism. And also, like I mentioned before, for the Tibetans, of seeing different religions, seeing science, and learning from these things, and also debating them. Yeah, because taking science and then putting it on the debate ground and see, our mind and brain exactly the same. Yeah, because I've heard His Holiness say that sometimes he hears when the monks are debating that they just say, well, yes, there's rebirth because so-and-so said so, and he says that you can't just quote scriptures to prove the point. Scriptures kind of reaffirm something that has been proven by logic, but he, many years ago started telling the monks, you have to know the reasons for this. The reasons why the mind is not the brain, and the reason for why rebirth exists, and debate that. And I think that's something that's quite big, affecting Buddhism, and affecting other religions as well.
Well, thank you, Thubten Chodron. We could listen to you for hours and hours and hours. And hopefully we'll be able to welcome you again and host you in person in Delhi at some point.
Oh.
And that will be a rich blessing And, from the profound depths of Buddhist wisdom to the frontiers of scientific inquiry, from advocating for the Tibetan cause to promoting universal ethics, His Holiness has given us a roadmap, and you have helped articulate it so well. To live our lives with compassion, resilience, and purpose. And so, as we conclude these teachings, they offer something timeless. And thank you. And
Okay.
and
I want to thank you also.
And virtual prostrations to you.
Okay. And thank you so much for heading the Foundation of Universal.
No, I don't have this. His Holiness is the boss. He's the.
Well, likewise for whatever I say, His Holiness is the boss. And that's why I tried to be very clear when I was just telling my opinion and not. But yeah, thank you very much.
And will you give us a final blessing before you go on to your next engagement?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So may we all who have listened to His Holiness's teachings that are based on what the Buddha taught and embody what the Buddha taught so many centuries ago. May we all learn these teachings, think about them so we understand them correctly, meditate and practice them so that we are able to transform our own minds and to transform the societies that we live in. And so in this way, may we have peaceful, wise, compassionate minds, and may we share that with all other living beings with compassion and respect.
And so, Tashidele.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.